together with love.
Morning. Reading this morning will be from Romans chapter 1, verse 8 through 15. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayers, making request if, by some means, now at last I may find a way in the will of God to come to you. For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift, so that you may be established. That is, that I may be encouraged together with you by the mutual faith, both of you and me. Now I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I often planned to come to you, but was hindered until now, that I might have some fruit among you also, just as among the other Gentiles. I am a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to wise and to unwise. So as much as is in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also.
Thank you. Good morning, church. Before I get too far into my beginning of my lesson, I just want to say thanks to Shannon, because the Christmas party yesterday was much fun. I think everybody enjoyed themselves, and I know personally that takes a lot of planning and preparing to get that done, so I just really appreciate her efforts in that. This apartment complex is the apartment complex that I grew up in as a little boy in Troy, Illinois. And as a young kid, I was into sports. I mean, I love sports. So there wasn't a time on a day like you see here that we weren't outside playing. I mean, we played all the time. The thing is that these brick buildings had ends to them, and they made great places to play ball games so that you didn't have to go chase the ball, because they would always ricochet off these brick wall buildings. The problem is, in one of these complexes lived one of the most cantankerous men I've ever known in my life. He did not want us bouncing any balls against the wall that he lived in. And his reasoning was, it was a good one. His wife was ill, and I guess the constant sound of the ball hitting that brick really bothered her. So we made efforts as much as we could to try and keep from hitting the balls against that particular wall. But of course, there would be times when we would have friends over to play, and they didn't have any knowledge of this guy or this wall. And before we could even say anything, we'd kick or throw the ball, and it would hit that guy's side of the building. And we've had a couple of times where he actually came out and took our ball. We had to actually coerce my mom to go and get involved. But here was a guy that we as young people, sorry for our older members, as young people, we declared war on this older man. I mean, he stood against our freedoms we felt of us having fun and being able to play ball. Now that's an odd way to begin a lesson that deals with showing kindness. But that's our theme, about showing kindness in all situations. And that's what our text is going to be centered on. We're going to see kindness shown towards Paul, but we're going to see Paul reciprocate efforts to show kindness. And we're going to see that the story of Acts doesn't end with chapter 28. But the story of the church continues through Acts 29 and so on and so forth. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So turn over, if you will, to Acts chapter 28. We are in the last chapter of Acts. And we're just going to read the first few verses here to get us started. After we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and they welcomed us all because it had begun to rain and it was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hands. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." He, however, shook the creature into the fire, suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead, but when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds, and now they decided that he was a god. So, the events of the shipwreck, the events of taking Paul to Rome, end up on this island called Malta, and today it's called St. Paul's Bay. Sorry, got the wrong P name. St. Paul's Bay. It's actually located along the central area of the Mediterranean Sea. It's actually one of the largest islands there. And they come across on this island what is called in my translation native people. You might be surprised that the actual word here means barbarian people. And we don't like that word because barbarian people often has a politically incorrect connotation behind it. We would equate barbarians with the same word that we use of savages. And we know how the word savages was used. It usually painted a picture of people who were very hostile and hard to get along with. Such as when we were trying to establish ourselves in this country with the Indians that were already living here. But we might be surprised that the word savages and barbarian doesn't mean what our English translation or what our English ideas now tell us that word means. It just simply means they didn't speak Greek. They didn't understand the language. That's all it meant. So that's actually the origin to the idea of who were barbarian people. Not that they were hostile, and because we can read the account, and they weren't. They were showing unusual kindness to these shipwrecked individuals. It just simply means, again, that they did not speak Greek. But they show unusual kindness. Why does he call it unusual? I don't know. It could be that they weren't expecting the degree of kindness that they were shown. It's possible. But their kindness is seen on this cold night of preparing a fire for their benefit, to give them some warmth, to give them some relief from the seriousness of the storms that they've just encountered. And it is here where we encounter another problem for Paul. He's helping gathering stickwood, and in the heat of the fire, a snake bites and fastens himself on Paul's hand. Let me tell you something. There has been, it's unbelievable, there has been no problem more in this chapter for scholars of the books of the Bible than dealing with this snake. It's amazing. It's like the snake is the biggest burden for scholars out of everything else in this chapter and really even in this book. And it makes me wonder, at least, how are these people called scholars when they let such trivial things cause them so much problem? Here's the reasoning why I'm saying all this. There are no venomous snakes that exist on this island today. So, here's the reasoning. Since there are no venomous snakes on the island today, Luke evidently made an error. A snake definitely bit Paul. He thought it was poisonous, or venomous actually, but Luke was mistaken. That's one reasoning. Second reasoning is the islanders evidently made a mistake. They thought it was poisonous. They thought when it bit Paul he was going to swell up and die. They expected him to. But actually, it wasn't a venomous snake at all. They just thought it was. Because some non-venomous snakes can actually look like or even take on the characteristics of venomous snakes, such as the bull snake. The bull snake actually is a non-venomous snake. And you all people that say a good snake is a dead snake, this is one of the most beneficial snakes for helping control rodent population that we have. They are a friend to you. But they can look like and even act like a rattlesnake. Now, let me just kind of veer off. It's better not to get around them at all, okay? Because especially if you don't know what kind of snake it is. But the point of this is, going back to my lesson here, they thought it was a venomous snake, but they were mistaken. That's the second thing. That's the second reasoning. Here's the other thing. Some venomous snakes actually bite you and then let go. So the scholars have now come up with what snakes actually bite and let go, because we'll eliminate them, and what snakes actually bite and then hang on. It's the idea that we have to know what kind of snake this is in order for us to make sense out of this passage. My whole thing is, does it really matter to the story? Does it matter to the lesson in the story at all what kind of a snake it is? See how we get bogged down by just stupid stuff. Sorry, it is. It's dumb stuff. It's a bit of trivia that really has no impact to the story at all. The only thing that matters, really, is that the islanders have a perception of Paul as a result of this viper. They think first, he's overcome the sea, and they can see the condition of the ship, to see what they've gone through. But what they've reasoned is, he escaped from the sea, but obviously he's guilty of murder or some other very serious crime because justice has been met. This man is about to die, and they're sitting there waiting for it to happen. Now, thing is, these islanders probably have experienced a time when good people get bit. Did you know that sometimes good people get bit by snakes? They do. So it wasn't just because Paul was bit that they reasoned this. They're looking at all the circumstances of his coming here. They're looking at his chains, most likely. They're looking at all of the conditions. And through all of that, they've reasoned in their mind, he must truly be guilty. He probably should have died out on the ocean, but he didn't. But fate has played its hand. He will die with the snake, the bite of this snake. But when nothing happens, then they reason the opposite end and say, well, he must be a god then. Let me tell you something. Since I've lived here, I've had the privilege of going to this place several times. And I actually love it. It's actually very unique zoo. It's up in Rapid City called Reptile Gardens. But as you're looking at all of the creatures that they have, especially in the dome, they have pictures on the wall that actually show the result of people who have been bitten by venomous snakes. And it is horrific what happens to people that get bit, the venom that actually works through the system of the body. And I spared you the images of those pictures because they are horrific looking. The point that I'm trying to make is when Paul was bitten, that's what they were expecting to see. But when he shows no ill effects at all, probably not even any swelling, instead of reasoning that there's been a miracle of God, they think that Paul himself is a god. But what this situation does is it really goes and allows two things to happen. The first thing is something we've constantly talked about. Once again, something has tried to hinder Paul's ability to get to Caesar. And yet God's providence overpowers all the bad things in Paul's life to get him there. Second thing that it allows is Paul has the opportunity now to return that hospitality. As you look at the next set of verses, he's on the island with a leader, a chief man on the island whose name is Publius. And it says that Paul actually goes in and lays his hands on Publius, who's sick with fever and dysentery. And after Paul's prayer, he is healed. So it gives Paul an opportunity to show kindness to these islanders. And when they see the results of the miracle of Publius, they start bringing other people who are diseased to come before Paul. And Paul shows them kindness too. That gives me, a lesson here as I look at Paul's circumstance. Consequences of life cannot deter us from showing kindness to people unless we ourselves allow it to. Look at all the things Paul's gone through. He's gone through riots, unfair trials, whippings, imprisonment, threats of death. He's been through unjust judicial systems. He's been shipwrecked. He's been living in impoverished conditions. And now he's even been snake bit. And yet through all of this, Paul has continually attempted to show kindness to all of those that he has come in contact with. He could have really lashed out at those two governors, especially for the unjust ways that they handled his trial. And instead of justifying himself in doing so, he's always led in showing kindness to them. Remember what he said to Herod when Herod came to hear him? It is good that I finally get somebody who will hear my trial and understand what I'm going through. He didn't crab and complain to him about all the unjust treatments that he's gone through. He just simply said, I'm so thankful that it is you I get to share my story with. Kindness is something that we all can do, and consequences of our lives cannot deter us from showing it unless we choose not to be kind. Second thing, doesn't matter how much faith you claim to have, that doesn't keep unpleasant things from happening to you. Sorry. We get this reasoning, as long as you have faith, nothing bad will happen to you. You don't have nothing to worry about. Guys, that's not scriptural at all. Yes, we have to be very careful with what our worry does with us. Do we not? Worry can control us. But I want you to think about that does not mean unpleasant things won't come our way. And I've given you examples. What did Job do to deserve the things he went through? His friends thought it was because he'd sinned grievously. But he did nothing. What problems did Joseph do other than telling his family members what he dreamed? They didn't like that. Moses didn't even want to go. Remember? He gave every excuse, legitimate excuse he could think of to God. And after he committed to it, there were several times when he complained to God about, look, I'm in an unfair situation. If you're not going to help me out here, just take my life. Because I can't handle the burden of all of these people. David is another one that experienced hardships in his life. What did he do to Saul that deserved him being threatened with his life. I know what he did later on in life, and nonetheless, he always followed God, and it didn't keep him from unpleasant things happening. Neither did it the prophets, neither did it Jesus or all of the apostles. But here's the thing. When our faith, did I have it here? No. When our faith becomes our focal point, when our faith becomes our focal point, it is God who helps us through our trials. He's the one that gives us strength for us to overcome those trials. Faith, and faith is not just belief, it is obedience to God as well. But faith, if that is our focal point, God will give us the strength to overcome. Well, evidently on this island, there are other Christians with Paul, because now these brothers and sisters are given opportunity to show kindness to Paul. It says that after they've gone to all of these places, verse 14, there we found brothers, and it should be brothers and sisters. We were invited to stay with them for 7 days, and so we came to Rome. And the brothers there, when they heard about us, came as far away as the Forum of Appius and 3 taverns to meet us. And on seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. And when we came into Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldiers who guarded him. I've asked the question as I got here, how long has it been for Paul to finally arrive to Rome? I mean, think about all the shipwreck and the standing before Herod. How much time has there been before he's now stepped onto the ground of Rome? We know at least 3 months he was on the island, because the text tells us. But they've also made several stops along the way on this ship. Then they had all of the damage to the ship. But it is my understanding that when a person appealed to Caesar, there was like a 2-year window for the case to actually be brought before Caesar. And if the case was not brought to Caesar within that window, Caesar would just dismiss the case. Now, I don't know if that's true, but that's what I've understood in researching this. So but my point is that every effort was made to try to get the prisoner who has appealed to Caesar to actually stand and have his case tried by Caesar. Okay? But it is here that we see a welcome sight for Paul. And Paul is so encouraged, it says that he's actually thanking God and taking courage because of these individuals. And I think about all of the people that were there in Paul's life when he needed kindness shown to him. He had people like Luke. He had people like Timothy. He had people like Barnabas and Apollos and Aquila and Priscilla, and he had Epaphroditus, and the list of brothers and sisters go on and on and on. You know what? When you get to those pages where it says, you greet these brothers and these brothers greet you, we don't know a lot of those names, and so we just bypass and think, well, that's not an important thing. But here's the thing. They were important to Paul. They were important because they were his support system through the most difficult of circumstances. So even though those difficult names we don't like to read and it's blah, 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 that's what I hear, these people really meant something special to Paul. Because in most times, he had nobody else to give him encouragement. But it leads me to a point. Christians need to. They need to have the benefit of your kindness in mind. We need the benefit of people being kind to one another. Not just when you want to, because you never, ever, ever know what somebody else is dealing with unless you've walked in their shoes or lived their life. we as Christians need the kindness of one another. We need the benefit of encouraging one another, because it's very easy, even for Christians, to get a little down. So we need to be looking for ways to say, you know what? I'm praying for you. If you need somebody just to be there, I'm willing to. But I'm going to lift you up in prayer, and if I can, if you'll allow me, I will help you see the God who will give you strength through the most difficult part of your journey. We need to show people love for each other. That's what we're commanded to do. And let me tell you something. I just talked with a preacher friend of mine who just talked about they have not had the benefit like you and I have, where we had a small window of time where we weren't able to meet together here, but we've been able to meet pretty much for the better part of the last year or plus. We have some Christian brothers that still don't have that benefit. And they're still fighting this idea that people have become so comfortable staying home and watching it on the videos, and they haven't been coming together and being in the company of other brothers and sisters. And I've said this before. We are commanded, first of all, to be in the company of other brothers and sisters. That's the Hebrews passage. Don't give up the forsaking of the assembly, as some are in the habit of doing. Yes, I know the context means totally walking away from the faith, but people have already begun to do that when they have chosen to isolate themselves from their brothers and sisters. I've said before, you know who Satan or a lion attacks? The weak and the isolated. That's who are the most vulnerable. We need the company of one another. But I'll just tell you, for those that are sitting at home instead of being here in the company of us, in what ways are you encouraging anybody here? And really, in what ways can we encourage you? I love the fact that we can be on the internet, because it is a good ministry tool, is it not? But it is not meant for people to become complacent in showing up and being an encouragement to one another in the assembly. Now, let's go to the third thing. Paul now has opportunity to show kindness. We don't always equate it, but showing kindness is also seen in your ability to teach the gospel. That's one of the most kindest actions that we can have. And Paul in Rome has one last opportunity. What is interesting is in this text, there's been no documentation that's actually reached anybody pertaining to the case. You know, they were so bent on getting Paul killed, you would think that they would have documentation. But if you look down here, verse 21, it says the only thing they know, we've received no letters from Judea about you, and none of the brothers have come here. They've not reported, they've not spoken any evil of you, but it says we've desired to hear from you what your views are. For with regard to this sect, we know that everything in it, everywhere it's spoken against. So the only thing they know is this sect, that's what they call Christianity. Everybody's speaking ill of Christians. But as far as Paul, there's been no documents, and there's been nobody there to actually bring up charges against Paul. So what Paul does is he's given one last opportunity the very next day to testify to the kingdom of God and try to persuade them, convincing about Jesus. And what does he do? He goes to the Scriptures. He says, let me teach you from the Scriptures. He goes to the law of Moses. He goes to the prophets. He starts trying to convince them. And it says that some of them were actually convinced. But there's still so many that don't believe. And it says, after disagreeing among themselves, they departed after Paul made one last statement. And here he quotes the prophet Isaiah, and he says, go to this people and say, you will indeed hear but never understand. You will indeed see but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have been closed, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with the heart and turn, and I will heal them. And then Paul says, therefore I'm going to let you know I am now going to the Gentiles. And that's the way the book of Acts ends. It says he lived there 2 years. There were people that welcomed him, and he continued just proclaiming the gospel message all the time he was there. But here's the thing. Jesus also quoted this passage from Isaiah and said that that still pertained to the religious people of his day. The truth of it is, there's never been a time when there haven't been people who have rejected the gospel message. Isaiah, I don't know how encouraging it would be to you, but if God were to come to you and say, I'm going to appoint you to be my spokesperson before my people, but I just want you to know that you're going to proclaim my message to a people that are going to be stubborn, they're not going to listen to you, they're not going to see see the fruits of what you're saying, they're not going to have anything to do with your message. How encouraging is that going to be to you? And yet it persisted in Jesus' day, it persisted in Paul's day, and let me tell you something, it persists today. The only difference really is now we have a stubborn people, not just of the Jews, but of Gentile people too, that have chosen to reject God's message. And yet, the church has continued to be present even in the midst of these difficulties. That's called the providence of God. You see, while that story ends here in Acts 28, there is a continuation of the story of the church. And that continuation deals with you and me, believe it or not, if we're a part of the story. The church continues to exist. It always has. From the day of Pentecost on, it has continued to exist. The church's story has continued to be the source of God's salvation. Because if we're preaching the way to be saved, as they did on the day of Pentecost, then it is the source that stands behind God's salvation. And the church's story has continued to overcome threats of Satan, government leaders, racial tensions, illness, biases, and every other faction that has stood opposed to the Lord's church. The church has still been able to overcome, even though the church, the members of the church itself have done a lot of things to actually cause problems for God's church. The church's story continues in the speaking of God's providence. Sometimes that's not a message we hear too often from the pulpit, but let me tell you something. No matter how many difficulties godly people have had, what he chooses to have happen always comes to fruition. Always. Number 2, we speak of God's faithfulness, and we speak of his assurance, especially through the challenges that we have in our life. So we too are a part of Acts 29, even though it's not actually in the pages of your Bible. It's just the continuing story of the church. And we're a part of that if we belong to him. Well, we moved out of those apartment complexes, but we didn't move off the street. We moved actually across the street to another set of housing apartments. But after we had moved, my brother and I actually got to talking. It was near Christmas time, and I don't even know the year, honestly. And I says, what would it be like? I wonder what would happen if we actually got this old man that we had had all these problems with. What if we just did something nice? So we went up to the local store, gas station store. We didn't buy anything expensive. It was just, some candy. But on Christmas morning, We went over there and knocked on his door. And I could almost hear he was like running to the door because he wanted to catch us. Because he could see us walk by his house. And was he not shocked to see us standing at his door saying, we bought you something for Christmas? And his whole demeanor changed. All of a sudden, these kids that were no good and causing so many problems, he couldn't speak more kindness of us if he tried. Why? Because even though we probably could have just persisted in making his life miserable, which we did. Up to that point is what I meant. Fact of the matter is, our kindness changed the relationship. Are you in need of some kindness today? Or are you in need of maybe showing kindness to somebody that maybe you have hurt? Or maybe something that you have said inappropriately? You can change the whole dynamic of your relationship by showing kindness. The kindness of Christ is seen in the cross and his offer of salvation to us. His kindness is seen as a way of saying he cares, he loves us, and he wants what's best for us, including in eternity with him in heaven. His kindness is seen in saying, I've offered this for you in the source of my Son. What I require you to do is to acknowledge me before men. Say that you believe that my Son is indeed my Son. Repent from your wickedness. Repent from your sins. And let me take care of the sin problem by washing them away through the waters of baptism. God's kindness is seen in his offer. Are you wanting to change your relationship with the Lord? Accept his kindness as we stand and as we sing.